Welcome to the Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice, brought to you by Accessible Archives. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and the editorial director at Choice, and this week, once again, I'm joined by Lorraine Estelle, project director at Counter, Stuart Maxwell, vice president of business development at Scholarly IQ, and Iris Haney, president of Unlimited Priorities, the exclusive sales agent for Accessible Archives. And we wrap up our conversation about measuring e-resource usage by talking about how the various flavors of open access impact Counter reports, with a special focus on the upcoming release of Code of Practice 5. So we started talking about open access, and I wonder, Lorraine, if you could, give us a bit more of a sketch on how the various types of open publishing, especially in the journal world, because this is a big deal now, obviously. How does this impact Counter reports, and especially maybe looking forward to the COP5 release and how that accommodates, the varying degrees of OA?
Very much in terms of developing Release 5 of the Code of Practice. We were very aware of the different publishing models and really wanting to make sure that we developed Release 5 into something that was fit for purpose for these emerging models. I think that the really important thing in terms of the journal world is the hybrid journal. And a hybrid journal is a journal that has open access and subscription content in the same journal. So this typically requires the payment of publication fee, also called an article processing charge, to the publisher to make content immediately open access, while other content remains behind the paywall. And understanding that is very, very important for librarians. I think particularly where here in the UK and Northern Europe, librarians are very often managing not only the subscription funds, but also the funds for those article processing charges. So really understanding what's going on there is very, very important. In terms of the hybrid journal, librarians want to understand what is the cost of the content that's behind the paywall. So we have developed in Release 5 what we call our standard views, so that they can see just the content in a report that they are paying a license for, so they can do that cost per download calculation. They can also see separately the open access use, but it's really important that they can divide those two things up. So I think that has been very important in developing Release 5. But I think also as well, in the open access world, there are other things going on. I mean, funders, I think, are becoming increasingly interested in not just citations, but a whole basket of metrics. So I think we have to have our eye on that it's becoming increasingly important to look at different things. And also I think we've designed Release 5 so that it is not just for commercial publishers, but it also works for institutional repositories as well, because of course they're fully open, but they want to demonstrate their value to the funders, to the institutions, and so on. So a very, very key part of the development of Release 5.
Okay. Stuart, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Exactly as Lorraine says, I think the thing, if we kind of go back to sort of the basics of what Counter does, Counter is a standard for what we count and how we report it as far as usage is concerned as a quantitative metric. So the total activity on a counted basis of user interest and consumption and engagement with content. Now, whether it's subscription content, in which case the primary use that, most of us traditionally have looked at it is relation to justifying those subscriptions and spend. Okay, but for open access, it's also looking at, who are those stakeholders? Who are the people who have an interest in understanding and justifying value based upon that usage? And, within institutions, obviously that's important, as Lorraine Norris has said, but also there are these other relationships. There are the gold open access, the people funding, the publishing of something on open access. There are the authors interested in the value, how much their content is being used. There are the funding bodies in these relationships, and the industry agreed metrics and standards for this are just as applicable to those stakeholders as it is for a librarian looking at the justification of their subscriptions. If we look at national bodies in Sweden, or we look at the Wellcome Trust or wherever else, if they're funding these for where things are published and what content is going there, then actually the usage of putting it in the hands of researchers is just as important. And therefore the metrics and the currencies they use for justifying that in an accountable way has to still apply. And Counter is relevant for doing that. Now, part of the difficulty that comes from this is also about kind of how we show that justification. Because normally what happens with a subscription publisher is they have some form of authentication that when a user logs in, okay, that usage that they carry out can be accredited or attributed to that particular institution. And therefore that usage is assigned to that institution as part of their subscription. This is how much usage you've had, because when they log in, it says, I'm from University of X. The difficulty on some of the open access stuff is that if that publisher if that institution isn't part of your subscription base, you may not have that authentication process. And therefore, you can't necessarily say that this usage is going to an institution rather than anywhere else, because it doesn't need that sort of security step for saying this is us coming into it. And so when we look at it maybe from the position of a funder, or maybe from a repository or an open access publisher or a librarian looking at use of that, if they haven't got that relationship, then you can't necessarily say how much of this open access usage was actually being used within academic institutions. And that can be a trouble in actually helping to justify some of those areas. So it still possibly needs that engagement with the librarians to do that. We're doing some stuff with the IP registry as an independent database to use that as a lookup for that. Shameless plug. But, that gives us a database to work with against 60,000 libraries. But if you haven't got it there, if you're reporting to a funding body and say, look, yeah, we've published your content, it's used X many times within the last month, is it not of interest to that funding body to also turn around and say, it has reached 2,000 academic institutions' researchers? Yeah, that is of value to say it's getting in the hands of other researchers. We funders fund this scientific research to put it in the hands of other scientific researchers. Sorry, Iris, I'm going down the STEM route, but put it in the hands of those individuals to enable them to push forward the boundaries of research. And if it's not going necessarily to that, something may get in an open access world a big old boost. Let's say, for example, just this week we had the stuff that came out about somebody accidentally has discovered an enzyme that gets rid of plastics, or at least is starting as an opportunity to get rid of plastics, which is phenomenal. Now that's been in the national newspaper. You look at that click and that link. How much of that, if that's published open access, how much of the usage of that came through from people clicking through from news stories, and how much of that was going into the hands of, or there's consumption by, researchers within other academic institutions? Great, it's of public knowledge, but a funding body, their drive is actually, hopefully, is to push scientific research in that one small field in that way. And so therefore knowing what goes to institutions is important. And it's a challenge to get that attribution right, to demonstrate how that value is being delivered.
Okay. And open access, it again goes back to the days when we were all print publishers and we were scared to death of microforms, CDs, online, because, oh my God, what was it going to do to print? Then came along the Kindles, the e-readers, and what was that going to do to print? Then came along open access, and what was that going to do to everybody? at the end of the day, look around. Have anything printed in your office, do you? The answer is clearly yes.
Mm-hmm.
And accountability needs to be held to the same standard regardless of whether it's open access or paid for access. Because at the end of the day, the library, the funding agency, the government agency still needs to be responsible for providing to whoever their end users are high quality, needed content. And the only way to do that and make everybody accountable for that occurring is to have some consistent form of measurement. So whether it's open access or not, if you're at work and you're searching an open access database versus one that you've paid for, is there no cost involved? Somebody is paying you to search.
Right.
Somebody's paying your heat, light, and music to be there at that seat. So the accountability, whether it's open access or whether you're paying for it in a different form, is still there. And as I mentioned earlier flippantly, but I'm not being flippant, ain't nothing free about anything. You're paying for it in some form or another, and therefore everybody needs to be accountable in some way. And I do question whether all the open access folks are as accountable as they could be, and whether all the funders are as aware as they should be of what they should be asking for. And I will say, and I think I still have a little bit of time left, long before the end of my lifetime, paid for content will still be very largely used in our marketplace, and open access will always have a place, but it's not going to take over.
Accessible Archives is a rare provider of American primary source materials from the 18th and 19th centuries, incorporating county histories from each state and a wealth of African American and Civil War content, as well as journals covering nationwide gazettes and publications that chronicle decades of American history. Offerings also include free MARC records, partnerships with discovery services, and full counter-compliant data. For a complete list of collections, as well as open access versions of 12 Years a Slave and Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, visit accessible-archives.com. Please contact Iris Haney at iris.hanney@unlimitedpriorities.com for a free trial, price quotation, or a customized webinar. Unlimited Priorities is the exclusive sales and marketing representative for Accessible Archives. And Stuart and Lorraine, I mean, in your part of the world, there's a lot more pressure now on producing OA material with the mandate and everything like that, and it's not quite there yet here, but there's an awful lot of interest nevertheless. You know, is this extra pressure, I guess, on the open access issue? How is that impacting, you know, what Counter is doing in sort of a looking forward kind of way?
Well, I think that here in the UK and in Northern Europe, we are seeing a huge amount of change. As you may know, there was a very influential report published in the UK 5 years ago, the Finch report, and that led to the full UK higher education funding bodies and the research councils to put its recommendations into practice by working with universities, the research community and the publishing communities. And libraries, institutions, but usually managed by the libraries, receive funding to pay for gold open access through APCs. And in Germany, Austria, Scandinavia, they have similar initiatives. And I think certainly we can see that the percentage of open access is growing. I think where one of the things people are looking at now, and here in the UK and Europe, libraries are spending an enormous amount of time measuring and collecting data. It is, I mentioned, the hybrid journals, the amount of open access in hybrid journals. So people are looking at that, and all those stakeholders are looking at that with great interest. Mm-hmm. I think the funders are looking at it and perhaps feeling that it is not creating that transition to open access that they had expected it to. And there is a tension there because, of course, the idea of the funders is that they want that content open access. If it's publicly funded, they want it to be open to the public. But they also expected that those initiatives to lead to this open access world. But equally, they would never want to tell an academic where to publish. So there are tensions around that, in particular. A lot of the librarians I'm speaking to at the moment, and of course there is a cost to this, as Iris said earlier, they are, of course, monitoring usage and cost of subscription content, but they're also spending a lot of time capturing and counting the cost of gold open access, collecting the publication data and the usage data, of course, so that they can get the picture of the total cost of publication. How much is the subscription content and how much is the gold open access content costing in total? Mm-hmm. So, we have quite an industry here gathering data of all types and probably need a few more standards as well because in some of those areas, not usage obviously, but some of those areas, the librarians I'm talking to are struggling because there aren't always the standards.
Okay. I do want to kind of close out the series with a question about trends.
Sure. There was one thing I just wanted to add to those last sort of comments about sort of the open access thing. And that was that we do have this shift towards open access on how people see things going and what we want to do. But we don't necessarily, open access isn't necessarily going to be the end game, the end model that we work with. There's a market trend to want to say this is the model that we should be looking for because of the nature of funding and then self-paying and then subscribing to the research that somebody has already funded. And that's natural that kind of comes from there. But there are two sort of other sides of looking at this. There'll be a movement towards this. But, we got to remember as well, we used to buy, records, cassettes, CDs, and the rest of it. And then Napster came up and then everything was kind of available online. And actually you don't need to buy anything. But actually at the right price for the right product, people do buy things. We have Spotify. We have other music channels that we can subscribe to. And actually, we do pay for those things because they offer value adds and they offer it in a price that is agreeable for what they do. And, it also helps to protect, particularly there, for example, the music industry because it keeps a revenue model going through for those sites. And, we do see already kind of stories about, people being able to push stuff to open access that actually shouldn't really get through checks and balances. And we mustn't forget the value that publishers provide in doing that. And actually, if there isn't the funding model to help them do that, what is going to be that model? And possibly there are other things that, the publishers are also able to do, the value add they have, maybe around data mining, maybe around meta content, that actually, kind of a purely open access publisher will not be able to support that on those bases. And, maybe also there are other financial models possibly through, data insight or whatever else. As a publisher, they can provide other areas of research and other financial models, possibly through from having more open access or possibly lower cost type content. And so kind of as the industry evolves, whilst we have a shift to open access, I just wanted to say that it may not necessarily be that we're just going to end up in open access as the model. I do think that actually institutions, if they feel that value is there for services that publishers have and for the content they provide for it, and if it's at the right price, I always believe that institutions will pay subscriptions for that because the publishers have a tremendous value that they do provide, but it's finding the right balance of that model. And
Right.
just wanted to kind of add that in, maybe a balance on the open access piece.
And there are
Right.
just
I'm
two
glad you said
sentences. There are just two brief sentences that I want to add. Please always remember quality, quality, quality. And please always remember nothing is for free.
Right. Excellent. So yes, I did want to just address, with Release 5, just looking ahead. What are some of the new content formats, repositories, any other new trends that are emerging, Lorraine, in scholarly communications that Release 5 is addressing, or that you're, if it's not already, what you might be looking closely at in particular?
Yeah, well, there are a few things. I think one of the first things that we have done in developing the Code of Practice Release 5 is to really look to the future, not just business models and so on, but also changes in technology. So we have really tried to develop a Code of Practice that can be adapted and extended as digital publishing changes over the years. And with the release of Counter 5, we will be moving to a process of continuous maintenance. So we don't expect another huge release, which does have cost implications for publishers. It is very important that we design something that's adaptable. I think that we have designed a Code of Practice which is fit for purpose for commercial publishers, not just, we talked a lot today about STEM publishers, but also humanities and social science and indeed multimedia publishers, but also a Code of Practice that is fit for purpose for repositories and OA publishers. There's one other thing I think that I would mention as well that we're working on at the moment, and we are working collaboratively with DataCount and DataCite and DataOne, another collaboration, to create the first draft release of the Code of Practice for research data. And again, we can see that funders, institutions are not just looking at the content. They want to see the impact of that data which researchers create, that it's being used and reused and so on. So we have out with those other organizations, I mentioned a draft Code of Practice for research data. So, so I think we're really trying to look to the future, both in technology, business models, and the demand.
You just heard from Lorraine Estelle, Stuart Maxwell, and Iris Haney. This concludes episode 41, the final episode on measuring e-resources and the importance of standardizing metrics. This episode was brought to you by Accessible Archives. You can find all of the episodes of The Authority File on your favorite podcast app or on our website, choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship dropdown. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.